Welcome to the Rile Books podcast. My name is Chloe Chignall, and I'm very excited to be able to share with you the second recording from our Fall 23 program. We had the immense joy of hosting poet Ariana Reines at our space in Brussels on the 28th of October last year. In this recording, you'll hear Ariana read selected poems from a Sand book, published by Tin House Books in 2019, alongside some newer poems that will be published in her forthcoming book, The Rose. Ariana was then joined in conversation by poet and performing artist Stefa Govaart. We opened the conversation to the audience, and we really wanted to include this section in our podcast, so our editor Roz did their very best to make all of these questions audible for you. This event took place a mere 3 weeks after Israel began its brutal and ongoing attack on Palestine. Ariana begins her reading by thinking intimately on the intergenerational embodiment of trauma. I want to thank Ariana for her generosity in thinking live and speaking out loud, in a time when events move with such ferocious speed that taking the time to really think can often feel impossible. It's voices like Ariana's that can sustain us through the relentless horrors unfolding in our present. Ariana Reines is a poet, performing artist, playwright, and translator. She earned a BA from Barnard College and completed graduate work at both Columbia University and the European Graduate School, where she studied literature, performance, and philosophy. Ariana has published numerous books of poetry. Her most recent include a Sand book, which won the 2020 Kingsley Tufts Prize and was longlisted for the National Book Award. She has also published The Cow, Coeur De Lion, Mercury, The Origin of the World, and Telephone. Ariana is known for her interest in bodily experience, the occult, new media, and the possibilities of the long or the book-length form. At once personal, romantic, slippery, and extreme, Reines' poetry investigates and overturns lyric conventions. Of Ariana's work, the poet Melissa Broder writes, "To be fully human requires an act of sorcery nowadays, and Reines is that sorceress." Ariana is also an avid educator, having taught poetry and art at Scripps College, UC Berkeley, Tufts University, and Yale, among others. In 2012, she created Ancient Evenings, a platform generating creative writing through ancient texts, and Lazy Eye Haver, an astrology practice through which she sought to create new forms of arts and consciousness pedagogy. In March 2020, while a divinity student at Harvard, she created the Invisible College, a hub for poetry, art, and sacred study online, which is still ongoing today. Stefa Govaart works across dance, performance, and text. They studied dance at Parts, completed a master's in cultural analysis at the University of Amsterdam, and a master's in performance studies at NYU. They have worked with and for many choreographers and visual artists across Europe. They co-organize the Artist Gathering Spring Meeting at Performing Arts Forum in France, and are a founding member of the research group Sex Negativity at the Amsterdam School of Cultural Analysis. They currently teach at Parts and live in Brussels.
Oh, my water. Yeah, why not? Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm sorry I was late. I fucked up the taxi situation. You all seemed really relaxed, so maybe it's good that I wasn't earlier. We might have been a little more tense, but I am sorry. I just want to say briefly, this is an immensely overwhelming day. Of course, it's an eclipse day. It's a terrible day in a terrible war. It touches many of us very viscerally and personally. It touches our personal families. And I just want to also acknowledge this city has an important place in my family's history. Is it okay if I tell you? My grandmother walked here from Berlin. She was liberated in Berlin by the Russians at the end of World War II, and she walked here with two friends and was in a DP camp here. And when she was walking to the Polish embassy one day, she saw a man that she thought looked really Jewish. And so she asked him in German if he knew where the Polish embassy was, and he answered in Yiddish, "I'm going there." And that was my grandfather. Her husband had been exterminated, so the man she married was an ultra-Jewy looking little man, my grandfather. And my uncle was born here in Brussels. And my grandmother used to tell me that this city was so clean that every weekend you would see the women of every building, they would be cleaning the street in front of the building. Like they would clean the stairs and also the streets. Is this true? I grew up with this, so maybe it's all a lie. This is a story, a legend I grew up with in my family, because she used to talk about how filthy we were and what wild animals, and that in Brussels, the women would even clean the street outside their building. Well, maybe people were very excited that the war had ended. I mean, maybe people found other things to do with their weekend mornings. I don't know. Yeah, I could go on and on like an old lady, but I won't. I just want to say just a couple more small details. So, I used to argue with my grandmother about Israel throughout until she died. We didn't feel the same way about it. She really was of the generation, and also she had seen her entire family slaughtered. She really was of the belief that without the state of Israel, the Holocaust would happen again. She was of that generation, and she was of that experience. It's just a twist of fate that it happens that my family emigrated to the United States and not to Israel. My grandmother was the sort who suffered from terrible survivor's guilt. I won't go into the details of her story or why her particular way of surviving maybe added extra guilt. She was also a Cancer, for those of you who are astrologically inclined. In any case, my grandparents and my uncle, and my mother was in my grandmother's belly at the time, so my grandmother was pregnant. They entered the port of New York on my birthday, exactly 30 years before I was born. And I only learned this last year after my mother died. I'm sorry to bore you with the family stories, but it's very strange because my birthday was just 4 days ago. And a friend of mine who lives in Berlin and is very connected to documents, he's like one of those people who like always knows where all the documents are. Maybe some of you have that gift. He secured the disembarkation document from this boat. And I couldn't believe that it was my birthday that they set foot in the United States. And it made me accept for the first time in my life that I had a destiny with the United States of America, a place that I've never felt particularly comfortable. But I easily could have turned out Israeli. I just want to acknowledge that because I have never been to that country, and I think as a passionate pro-Palestinian American liberal, I think I felt a sense of superiority. I feel like the room just went cold when I said that, but I think that I did. And I've been confronting so many forms of grief, rage, powerlessness, disgust, self-disgust, racialized self-disgust in these past weeks. And it's also important for me to add, I suppose, a small précis about the misery of my little family, if you'll forgive me. May I just go on a tiny bit more? I know you've all been waiting, and now it's just like, ugh. My mother became paranoid schizophrenic, and she was homeless. She became homeless when I was 19. And it's a very long story that I'm not going to bore you with, but she committed suicide about a year ago. And I say this only to say that these atrocities are very difficult to heal from, that they take generations to heal from, and that they scar the mind of the world forever. I mean, it's not like the scourge of American slavery or the stories of Jewish slavery in Egypt. Those things don't go away. They're not eradicated from the psyche, I don't think. And it's extremely humbling to look at the total ruin of one's family, you know, because I thought I shouldn't, I was thinking like in the taxi, like I shouldn't say this because I don't know you and you don't know me and I've kept you waiting and it's an eclipse and it's this desperately flammable time. But I just wanted to offer this one thing because my ruined family was able to produce like this like little misshapen poet. Like that's what happens, I guess. Like, I don't know. Some people seem to turn out fairly well, but we didn't. I've noticed in my own adventures in healing that it's suffering that I have the hardest time releasing. Like, I hold on to it the most jealously, and it marks and defines identity so powerfully. It's really hard to understand how to be Jewish for people whose families were survivors because you associate it with just slaughter and suffering and insanity and things like that. So it's really hard to say this out loud. It might not be possible. So I'm already ruining the reading. I just wonder, I've been wondering a lot about the future today. I've just been wondering a lot about what it means to build a state out of so much suffering in response to so much trauma and what kinds of evil that perpetuates. And I wonder about what it means to build a state in response to the past and in order to forestall or try and keep down or keep away the present and the future. Am I making, some of you are nodding, okay. So I just wanted to say that. I've been thinking about that a lot today. There's something about trauma that does hold people outside of the present somehow. And well, now I've said too much, and so I'll stop talking. We'll just read some poems. We can maybe talk about this after the break, or never speak of it again. I could just like wave a wand and it will be as though I had said nothing. Um, yeah. Oh. Thank you. So I'm going to read to you from The Rose. It's a book I've finished, but I'm kind of still working on it. And one poem from a sandbook and one from last week, like that. Okay. A partial history. Long after I stopped participating, those images pursued me. I found myself turning from them, even in the small light before dawn, to meet the face of my own body, still taut and strong, almost too strong a house for so much shame. Not mine alone, but also yours and my brother's, lots of people's. I know it was irrational, for whom I saw myself responsible and to whom I wished to remain hospitable. We had all been pursuing our own disintegration for so long by then that by the time the other side began to raise a more coherent complaint against us, we devolved with such ease and swiftness, it seemed to alarm even our enemies. By then, many of us had succumbed to quivering idiocy, while others drew vitality from new careers as public scolds. Behind these, middle management professors were at pains to display their faultless views, lest they too find censure, infamy, unemployment, and death at the hands of an enraged public. Individuals in such pain and torment and such confusion, hardly anyone dared ask more of them than that they not shoot. And in fact, many of us willed them to shoot, and some of us were the shooters, and shoot we did, and got us square in the heart and in the face, which anyway we had been preparing these long years for bullets and explosions and whatever else. A vast, unpaid army of self-destructors, false comrades, impotent brainiacs who wished to appear to be kind. Everything we did for our government and the corporations that served it, we did for free. In exchange for the privilege of watching one another break down. Sometimes we were the ones doing the breaking. We would comfort one another afterward, congratulating each other on the fortitude it took to display such vulnerability. The demonstration of an infirmity followed by a self-justificatory recuperation of our own means and our own ends, in short, of ourselves and our respect for ourselves. This amounted to the dominant rhetoric of the age, which some called sharing, which partook of modes of oratory and of polemic, of intimate journals and of statements from on high issued by public figures whom at one time or another we all mistook ourselves for. Anyway, it wasn't working. None of it was working. Not our ostentation and not the uses we put our suffering to, the guilt and schadenfreude-based attention we extracted from our friends and followers, and even the passing sensation of true sincerity, of actual truth, quickly emulsified into the great and the terrible metastasizing whole, to the point it began to seem wisest to publish only within the confines of our own flesh, but our interiors had their biometrics too, and were functions not only of stardust, the universe, as we now were prone to addressing the Godhead, but also of every mean and median of the selfsame vicious culture that drove us to retreat into the jail of our own bones and the cramped confines of our swollen veins and ducts in the first place. Our skin was the same wall they talked about on the news, and our hearts were the bombs whose threat never withdrew. Images could drop from above like the pendulum in the pit in the pendulum, or killer drones to shatter the face of our lover and to contemporaneous pasts, futures, celebrities, and other lovers, all of whom our attention paid equally in confusion and longing and a fleeting sense like passing ghosts of a barely remarked upon catastrophe that was over both before and after it was too late. We were ancient creatures built for love and war. Everything said so. And we could not face how abstract it was all becoming because it was also all the opposite of abstract. It was our flesh, our mother's bloodied forehead on the floor of Penn Station, and wherever we hid our face amid a crowd of stars, as Yeats, for example, once put it, and for stars, insert celebrities or astrology here, your choice. And even when we closed our eyes, all this was all we looked at every day, all day. It was all we could see. We were lost in a language of images. It was growing difficult to speak. Yet talk was everywhere. Some of us still sought to dominate one another intellectually, others physically, still others psychically, or some of all of the above. Everything seeming to congeal into bad versions of sports by other means, and sports by that time was the only metaphor left that could acceptably be applied to anything. The images gave us no rest, yet failed over and over, despite the immensity of their realism, to describe the world as we really knew it, and worse, as it knew us. Sorry to be such a downer tonight, you guys. It's going to get much less serious, I think. If not much less serious, then much less worthy of seriousness, could we say? There's going to be sex soon. It's the consolation of the wretched, after all. To have seen what I saw only yesterday, you would beg for God as my heart did, though it knew better, kneeling and folding in on itself, circumcised eye, mouth hymning a tonsure. I saw a crimson hole in the delicate skull of a baby going gray in the arms of her rescuer, who prayed over her to himself. I would see God, not this world we made in its image. I would God saw what I saw, not through me, but on my behalf, not through me, but as my advocate, lucre and bullion, the orbs of Milton and Galilee, the lenses of Spinoza and Buchner, the sunsets of Borges, the sons of Stevie Wonder and Al-Ma'ari, and Father Knows Best. Beauty was in the eye of the beholder. What I saw, I did not know how to see. God Almighty, if there is a God, you must see it for me. Okay. Cain. I'm going to mostly not read the titles, but this one's about Cain. Cain is the one, remember Adam and Eve had twins, I think, or brothers, siblings. I forget if they were twins or not. They were brothers. Abel was the beloved one, and Cain was the not favored one. And Abel offers meat to the Lord, and Cain offers vegetable products from the field, which displeased the Heavenly Father, which caused Cain's countenance to fall. As it's written in the King James translation, his countenance fell, and then he murders his brother. And I always love that. It's like they make the offering, God is displeased, and his countenance fell. And then after that always comes murder. The city was humming gently under me like an adolescent quaffing deeply from the cup of righteousness. Out of practice with my own world, I was looking at how someone else saw it, longer than I realized, longer than I care to admit. Those goggles left a mark on me. Then I stared at my own face. An invitation came with my face to melancholy while nature purred at the edges of my perception, and before me lay a broad road enjoining me to do of myself and make of myself according to the American tradition. Secretly, I felt in new things I had not perceived my body turning into secrets. In other words, I did not notice the mechanism by which something within me noted my experiences and apprehensions of the truth would not be met with favor if I spoke them, which is not to say one speaks only to find favor, only that unreciprocated realities have a boring way of haunting the cells, pulling them somehow down, like the countenance of Cain, which fell one day and never rose again. And the fall of his face rhymed with the fall out of Eden, leading to the first murder and the invention of cities, where we now find ourselves, each tower the ghost of a farmer who failed to meet the favor of the Lord. Was feeling a little empty. Les heures mortes. The online pharmacy hasn't sent my UTI prescription to the CVS that's open. They sent it to the one that's closed. There's an ache in my belly. I fell asleep over it for about a half hour. I have these ways of falling asleep when I come before a deadness. I guess I can't go on. An ancient pull, something tired and hopeless. I don't want to converse within myself. An ancient pull, something tired and hopeless I don't want to converse with in myself. I learned writing my third book, the best thing to do when this happens is go to sleep. After practically going to sleep with quandariness, wrote Frank O'Hara, I think he knew me. I knew the way Joe was fucking me would mean a UTI, if not worse. Do you guys know what a UTI is? You probably have a different acronym in Flemish or French or German or whatever it is. What is it called here? It's not yeast, but thank you. That's a whole different kettle of fish. UTI. Thank you. Okay, so that's a universal acronym. Anywhere in the world, it's well known. Well, it's the universal punishment. That's why women shouldn't have sex. They say it's for other reasons that we shouldn't do it, but this is the real reason. Okay. I knew the way Joe was fucking me would mean a UTI, if not worse. It was worth it. This part's for the poem. I mean, that's what the loneliness is for. Les heures mortes is a painting I feel seen by. I'm a little bit scared to leave. I want a hug for having almost made it through. It's not that Joe eating my ass doesn't count as a hug. He held on to me for dear life the way people like us do. He more than hugged me, but there's an inner prophylaxis that protects us from loving when we're pouring out our love because we'll die if we don't, with people we hardly know. I have to read that again. Okay. But there's an inner prophylaxis that protects us from loving when we're pouring out our love because we'll die if we don't, with people we hardly know. We are desperate and we are children, and it's a secret we try to keep from the rest of our lives. We punish and reward one another for understanding and respecting this need. There's a rule not to speak of it. You love touch, Joe said our first night, with his eyes very soft and brimming with gratitude, running his hands carefully up and down the length of my body. The time for study comes after you blow his mind. The study just after is beautiful. That was hot as fuck, he says. It was all for you, he says. It's true what he says, and I didn't expect it. The gratitude is something you cherish, but you can't let on. It is decorous. It has tact. I love it, but the disgusting and Freudian thing I'm about to say might ruin the poem. That we cannot crawl back into our mothers. That our kidneys are tempered to the moment our father's sperm entered the ovum. that death can be seen in the left eye of a man, and hauntedness and evasiveness. And I saw all three in Joe's eye as he looked at me with a softness I knew I could not keep. None of the men I like to fuck has a father. I would learn how to love if I could. By God, I am trying. I want to so badly. There is no sex without consequence. Why couldn't I have a father? I could have lived a different life. The schooner weighs anchor in the harbor, then departs. The water bears no scar. The water bears a scar. I was thinking Les Heures Mortes by Dorothea Tanning and walked into my favorite convenience store. I'm scared to leave. I'm a little sad to leave. I'm tired from the energy it took to ignore Joe's texts. Anyway, you're not supposed to fuck with the UTI. They have fake designer sunglasses at the convenience store and unsweetened tea. I bought a can of Comet so I could scrub the sink before I go. When I lived in Hudson, I developed a great tenderness for cleaning products. I'm trying to earn before God the right to have a home. They didn't charge me for this pair of white and gold fake D&G sunglasses. I said silent words of thanksgiving to the man at the cash register, putting one by one and openly the things I paid for and the thing I didn't pay for into my bag. I told him thank you. He wished me a beautiful rest of my day. I had needed something free. I was feeling so lonely. I wanted a hug. I still want one. I wanted someone who loved me to tell me what a good job I'd done, and that it wasn't my fault my mother died, and that it wasn't my spiritual defects preventing me from saving her, stopping false wars, keeping the people I love from going crazy, that it wasn't my fault I hadn't yet learned how to live. I guess I must have healed enough to feel this pain. I was numb to it before. I feel soft, no better than anyone. I feel just, the heroine of nothing at all. Save the dead hours, the ones that leap to their grave at the center of me when I can't remember I'm alive, when I almost can't believe it, when I tremble at the freedom in me to speak a word, any word at all, which would never exist, not one single word, if not for that yearning, loving yearning to give what you know to your mouth. Receive all you know from it. The beginning of freedoms in speaking. It's my profession, and yet there's still so much. You have no idea how much I have no idea how to say. The truth is I never cared for a rose. It made me think of grandmothers, but not even my own. The feeling of exiting the airport, seeing a woman kneeling with her arms thrown wide as her child or her grandchild runs headlong into the absolute safety of her body. That welcome, that home, I loved it from the side. My longing was roses. The roses were somebody else's. Mother, home, complicity, never my own secret, but one belonging to them. My secret had no name, or should I say no addressee. I had a lover named Rose, whose secret was sorrow. In fact, his Rose was the sibling to mine. We tormented each other like brothers. Like ancient twins or Jacob and the angel. Love's metaphors, you will have to forgive me, have been agricultural, sports, and carpentry-oriented since time immemorial. His thumbs and body were hammers. His mouth was an infant in protest, M of dismay, child ripped from its mother, and so on. The terrible bud unfurled. I loved to hurt and be hurt by him. There was a locked and secret mansion in him that I loved. So I never even bothered to write this story. I stole it from time immemorial. And I'm just going to read a couple more and then we will adjourn for the break. Is that okay? Yeah? Okay. Refusal to rise. Refusal to rose. I white you out, I black you out. Refusal to rose, refusal to rise. Today your demise, tonight my prize. Refusal to rise, refusal to rose, addiction to sorrow and tomorrow, refusal to rose, refusal to rise, I black you out, I white you out, fear of rose, dread of rising, bloom surprising, no longer fantasizing, world at my feet, world in my hair, world in my arms, love beyond compare. In all those years I never dared write my desire, commend it here. In all those years I never dared speak my desire, command it here. Like a saint living in a window, moisturized and peeled, a small frog swells in the rain. Latent, sleeping, longing that lay down, a mustard seed, germ of faith whirling in the open space enclosed by the structure of Sarah's idea. She's immense. I sometimes think she's the first good woman, glamorous accomplishment, sex and reading, making a go of knowing yourself when it's raining, and because you always liked those dramatics, you're tempted into wishing you were dead almost just because it happens to be something you know how to do. Death has the biggest ick of all. Probably the reason women are still attracted to the devil, and will always be, is that's who fucked us originally to get life onto this planet. 2 more. After coming, he told me that when he comes with me, it starts before it has started and goes on long after it finishes. Sometimes after we fuck, he's delirious and says childlike phrases that almost rhyme and approach poetic sense. His head seems to pivot on its axis, and twitching, he loses consciousness. I could feel him hesitating to finish a compliment I wanted to receive in words, an energy I wanted to force him to force through language. You are going to give me this compliment directly, I said, and I steadied myself to receive it. Last night I told him I couldn't tell if he was a combination of highly intelligent and slightly retarded, or if he was simply kind of dumb, but that I had decided it was the former, since that way of seeing him gave me intense pleasure. A sexual genius with a highly erogenous void floating like a cloud of idiocy at the center of an otherwise powerful mind. For real, though. I didn't warn you about the content of this book. I mean, I kind of warned you, but sorry. Met another dude last night, 30 pounds heavier than his photos, and a kind of acne on his strangely slender upper arms. He works in a bar here, and I don't know why it only occurred to me yesterday that if bars intimidate me, they probably intimidate other people, which is, I guess, why you have to drink in them. A country singer with excellent teeth was making a racket that sometimes sounded like a song. Mostly it was the energy of where he came from, at a volume to blot out dread and fear and bring people in from the street. The guy I'd gone there to meet was the bartender, and he was good at his job, taking care of everyone, anticipating their needs, and making it look and feel like he was doing it for fun. He told me I was hotter than a crackhead spoon. I sensed something genuinely kind-hearted in there, but I didn't want to see him naked. How did I forget about bars? Maybe I was never in one as sort of nude as this one. It had dollar bills all over the walls and ceilings, and I saw a couple request the stapler and pail of markers practically upon entry. They seemed really excited to put their decorated dollar on the wall. I don't know why I thought I'd want to be a little drunk before doing that, but maybe they already were. There was one distractingly hot person in there, and otherwise everyone looked pretty wrecked. The hot guy was with a woman with wet, expressive eyes set in a face I could hardly see. It had somehow gone blurry. I felt she'd been a beauty once, and then things started to go slack and run out somehow in all directions, the life in her held together almost against its will by her bones. I saw her eyes find me. They were very dark, like pools. Having never been beautiful myself, I don't judge it callously when I see it. And I'm only talking about a certain kind of apparent beauty, the kind you could even drink away. To my right was a woman I heard say had recently moved here. I watched her attempt to mouth the words of one of the songs the singer was singing, but it was a song he had written, and I don't think she can have known it. I thought I felt a kind of rage in her. She was converting in real time into the good-natured willingness to have fun. Rage and sorrow over something having gone away from her that would not, she knew, stop going away. If I had ever loved liquor, if it had ever loved me, if I had ever had beauty to lose, I guess I used to feel that way, ripping my hair out at the root or smoking because I secretly yearned to dry myself out, my private language for hating my own sensitivity. Eating pills and powders precisely because they made me sick and homicidally horny, then dealing with the fights that went with that. But liquor isn't really in my genes. It never knew me particularly. I'd pour it in with the other things, but it left my body in a state of regret I just couldn't afford given the regret that was already there. And because I can't bear to end on regret, I have to read one more. I'm sorry. Really sorry. This one's for Jack Parsons. Do you guys know who that guy was? No Crowleyites in the room? I feel like there's got to be one. Maybe you're not. Can identify yourself. Jack Parsons was one of the founders of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. So he was like an early rocketry pioneer. And he was also a very devoted Aleister Crowley acolyte. And he and my dad have the same birthday. And I got into this because my dad and I don't get along. And I accidentally made up this father meditation. You could do it for your mother as well, where you find all the people who share the birthday of the offending family member, and then you meditate on them kind of rigorously, and you contemplate their good and bad qualities, and you get to judge them. You can judge them as severely as if they were your own parent, And I found it very healing, actually. And Gandhi shares my dad's birthday as well. My dad is no Gandhi, so it's also nice to think you're just a little worm compared to Gandhi, but also it might not be that easy to have Gandhi for a father, in all fairness. So Jack Parsons is my dad's birthday twin as well, and I kind of like the guy. I rather like him, but he's dead, so that it's easy for me. He blew himself up, actually, but there was some suspicion of foul play. I could go on and on. He married a really interesting artist named Marjorie Cameron, who she has a starring role in, I think, is it Invocation of My Demon Brother? If anyone likes Kenneth Anger movies. Right? Is that the one? I don't know. I don't know which one it is. Anyway, no, you guys don't care. You don't watch Kenneth Anger movies, and you don't like Aleister Crowley, which is good. It's great, even. Don't get into that stuff. For Jack Parsons, I've been interrupting and domesticating my drive to love for years, the same way I intervene on my lust to disappear. A man who should have forgotten about me by now keeps proving he hasn't. It doesn't make sense to me why I court something that's only barely the inverse of negation, like a trawler scraping the back parts of the mind. I can't get it up for fame or even a little attention. What's wrong with me? You need desire or some kind of combustion to move through life. There's a lot of people in my family who've treated me like I'm dead since I was 17. The silence of Dido and Eurydice, the lump in the throat of an almost stranger who won't swallow the idea I don't exist, does more for me than my own father or someone I actually know. I wish I could stop being such a pervert. I sometimes wish I hadn't learned how to be a poet. I don't know why I can't even think about money. Not really, not honestly. As long as I'm eating the way I want and sleeping and have my own thoughts and body, I can be happy. I can pretty much find someone to pay me the tiny amounts of attention I require to feel royal, move a hand purposefully down the nape of my neck into the muscles of my back as though it knows what it takes to possess me. I enjoy pretending I know what love is and that I'm in it. I skipped a date last night, fell asleep with Sinead O'Connor's gorgeous audiobook in my ears. Touch is what I subjugate the most these days. I like to need it a little too much. I have this superstitious wish to preserve its capacity to drive me crazy. It's a while now I've been far from anything like a crush or love, or even the supposedly normal and healthy human need for companionship. Maybe I'm just old or numb. Maybe I'm guarding that I need other people to stay feeling like an adventure instead of watching the boring way they rip each other apart once they've married or grown overly familiar to one another. During the years I really believed in my need for others, I felt writing was a flaw I'd overcome one day when I really learned how to love. Of course, my mother died before I could find out if I had learned. Concentration's a kind of bliss. Perception protected in its gel, imperturbable. Sex and love is an ancient coupling I sometimes think I perceive divorcing, that in these times it's sex and the mind, or mind alone, enrobed in its body, whose jet propulsion laboratory almost doesn't know the difference between driving ecstasy into another person and the stars. Thank you. So I forbid you to leave. You cannot leave. It's a break. But you're not allowed to leave. You can go outside, have your cigarette, change your state, like feel better, but you have
the final pages of a sandbook where you write like around October 7th, 2014, on a traffic island on Allen Street facing the Delancey Street in New York City, in a state of rapture. The final lines of a sandbook printed on black paper were given to you by the sun. Here, creation isn't an action, but a form of reception. A poem is simply given to one, received, then noted down without editing. The mystic doesn't belabor finesse. Perfection comes to her if she's open to it. She's got to open herself toward the trouble, labor, and beauty of reception. How does one prepare oneself to receive? How do you know that you're ready?
Thank you. I think poetry is a very democratic art. Anyone who has language could practice poetry, and personally couldn't live without it, because I suppose it's a reflective process, but most of the time you don't know what you're doing. But developing a practice of not knowing what you're doing, it turns out, has a certain value, because sometimes you find out what you think or where you are, and sometimes more is coming through it than you realize. And it's a really frail and strange art form, because you're toiling in the same medium that is passing through people's bodies and their phones all the time. Where it's very interesting, like in my lifetime, they were telling us that literature was dying the whole time that I was growing up. Like the book was dying, the novel was dying, publishing was dying, literature was dying, the earth was dying. They were telling us that it was all dying, and it was a lie, you know? What's interesting about having a practice in poetry is you just start to notice, I don't know if it's knowing you're ready, but you notice the thing that happens to you when you need to write something down. And of course, in the old days, the great sages, the first poets weren't writing it. Maybe it was coming through them as song, or maybe those songs and poems were given to them by jinn or angels or spirits or animals. And sometimes it happens that way too. Sometimes it happens without writing, but you start to feel it coming, you know? And I always feel like it's such a naked art form, and that causes a lot of anxiety, therefore. Like, you don't need any equipment, you don't need like a beautiful studio with nice light and like assistants, and you know, you can't go to the store to buy supplies. It's so nude in that way, and that nudity is really interesting because it can be really, really close. It can cut really close with a lot of precision to what the impulse itself is. And I think that that's one of the most interesting things about poetry as an art form. And it's also one of the reasons why we hate it, because that's why it can be so bad. And you don't know if it's going to be bad when it starts, but you have to let it happen to find out. And I guess there's something about that practice that's become a kind of theology, or it becomes a structure for devotion. But then it becomes very surprising, actually, because you think, like, I'm just like a dumb piece of shit, like I don't know what's going on. But it seems to filter a kind of knowing for you. And that's why I think it would be so wonderful if everybody practiced this art, because I'm not sure I believe in a talent for it. Like, there are definitely poets that I think of as like mega talented, but I'm not. What?
Who are they?
Oh, you know, like maybe Terrence Hayes, I think, is like magnificently talented. Like, he can write, he's a virtuoso, you know, like they're like virtuosic gifts, and he can compress ideas and make sounds and images happen, you know, like, I don't know, like symphonically. So, I mean, whatever. It's not that poets aren't talented, they are. But for me, like, I don't think that I have a particular gift for it. I think that I just had the unfortunate thing of it's the only thing that shapes my life. It's the only thing that shapes my thought. So I'm stuck with it.
But as a child, like, what kind of relation to language were you given? Or like, there must have been like a certain something that was being elicited in you. Right?
I can tell you a story. So when I was a little girl, I was like a dancer, music person. I had a really happy childhood until I was 7, and I was just like inside music. I like played the piano and I was dancing, but it was all like, I just felt like I was being in music, and I loved music so much. But for some reason, like, I got this super trite feeling that I think is probably maybe the beginning of all poetry, is like something like really cheesy. But I remember I think I was in 4th grade, and I saw like the curtains blowing in the breeze. And I remember starting to feel this feeling of like, when I had like a welling up of beauty, you know, like a welling up of love in like 3rd or 4th grade. And I was just like, I wanted to keep it somehow. And I wrote like a poem about the curtain billowing or whatever. And I showed it to my mother and I asked her if it was good. And she said no. Is history, but yeah, my mom was kind of cool. Like it was cool. Like she was very doting, but she was like the kind of mother, you know, you'd do something in Legos and she'd like take a Polaroid, you know, like she was a very doting mother, and she would like thought everything that we did was great, me and my little brother. But so when she was like, no, it's not good, and I was like, I wasn't even hurt because I was so confused. I was like, wait, what? Why? And she was like, well, you know, it's very cliched, like, and it doesn't really evoke the feeling, but she was like, you'll figure it out, like, eventually.
And what's your relation to the cliche now?
To cliche? Yeah. I mean, I only write about cliches, obviously.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I love them. What's more cliche than a rose?
The sun. You know.
Right, exactly. Yeah. No, I love cliches.
You have remarked that the primary medium of poetry is not language but breath, specifically the breath of the poet marrying the breath of the reader. This is the key to its intimacy, its strange physicality, and the incredible incitement it can provoke. This is also why bad poetry hurts so much. If you think of your poetry as a kind of mark-making, what kind of imprint do you think that the reading of your poem has on an audience?
Gosh, I have no idea. I think if I knew, I wouldn't be able to do this. I have no idea. I know how I feel when I hear poetry, though. Like, I could speak to that. Like, I still don't know how or why it is that it's so rewarding when it answers what my heart needs. I still don't understand why. Like, it seems to make life livable for me and for those of us who are touched by it. And I've noticed too that poetry is really beloved by people who know what suffering is. Like, people who know the price of happiness or of fulfillment, and people who have endured terrible things, unspeakable things. Poetry seems to answer like the heart's yearning in a way that, you know, some cultures and some people just are very aware of. You know, like in America, it's like, it's like the weirdest thing in the world. But in places where people aren't totally disconnected from suffering, the need for it is evident. So, yeah, I still don't understand why I swear to God, I still don't understand why I do it, even though I know that I'm doing it, you know? I think I've let go of this fantasy, but I used to think, like, I'll learn how to live one day and then I'll stop doing this. Does anyone else ever feel that way about anything? Do you?
That there's a moment that you know and then you stop. It's
a kind of fantasy of there being an other side to it or something. But now that I'm old, I accept I'm going to be doing it till the end. If I haven't gotten over it yet. But I mean, I don't know, something else could come along and just...
But not dance or music?
I mean, I love dance and music. I don't think I'm any more gifted for them than I am for poetry, but I love them. They make me happy. I wouldn't inflict it on anyone.
In a conversation with Ben Lerner, you say, everything I've done is about problems of address, I think, except for the theater. Then this is an oft-cited passage from Coeur De Lion. Now that I'm not addressing you, but the you of poetry, I'm probably doing something horrible and destructive, but this I is the I of poetry, and it should be able to do more than I can do. Can you address the problems of address in poetry by saying more about the I and the you, and also in the way in which sad problems work differently in the theater in your performance work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And also, I think I was completely lying when I said everything's about address. The play that I wrote and the things that I've done in theater and performance are completely about address. So I don't know what was wrong with me, because that wasn't true. I forget who taught me this, like that poetry isn't communication. Somebody said that to me once, some philosopher or something. But it's so related to communication, but it isn't merely that. And I think it fascinates me how human beings need art, because it's a kind of triangulation between people or between circumstances. And so that means that it's a different form of address. And it's a form of address that somehow involves more than just another person. Mm-hmm. I remember going to see the philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy speak, and he was talking about the origins of theater. He was speaking in a law school, and he was talking about the law, and he was situating the theater of the law in the context of the theater of the ancient Greeks. And he said that court, essentially, the courtroom, is a kind of theater that's based on Greek theater in which the audience isn't only the judge and the jury, but it's also the gods. And so theater preserves that. Like, you're there to entertain an audience. There's a show, there's a situation that's there for the audience, but you're also trying to convince or relate to or reach the gods. And I think that's sort of like the frustrations, the failures to communicate interpersonally are very inspiring to art. They stimulate us to seek a different kind of reciprocity. Mm-hmm. And the impoverishment of communication in daily life or in personal relationships stimulates that search. And in some ways, art is nourished by that. And then we have these beautiful palaces toward a more like dimensional, even psychedelic kind of reciprocity, where there can be a kind of relating that's not just between me and you, but it could be between groups of people. And of course, there could be animals and there could be spirits and gods. And why not relate to everything if you could? Mm-hmm. Type of a vibe. There's something so like, I'm sorry, I'm like, because I haven't been to Europe in a while, but it also makes me think of when I was like young and broke and living here. Not in Brussels, I was broke in Paris. And all my friends were students too, and our like little hovels were full of books. And just remember, like huis clos, no exit, like that hell is other people, that terrible idea that you're just stuck with a few people who don't understand you. That's like a carceral shithole, Nobody wants to be trapped there. That's also like your family. Like, what if we were all sent back to our mothers and our fathers? Like, what if a tyrant came into this room right now and like waved a gun and like put us all on transports back to our mothers and our fathers?
Yeah, you would have problems. Yeah.
I mean, sorry. Next question.
You've remarked that each book you've written has materially transformed you. How do you gather the energy and material conditions for the taking to task of your innards to materially transform one's living capacity? Like, what does that mean?
How do I get, like, practically?
Yeah, like what do you mean, I guess, like by materially?
Okay.
Like a transformation that is material in you, like by way of the book.
Yeah. For some reason, the only way that my life changes is if I make art. And I remember seeing a Jacques Brel interview, and he said something kind of similar, and I was like, they tell you that, like, your life is going to happen to you, and life is just going to come, and it's just going to carry you along. And he was like, that's a complete lie. Life never came for me. Nothing ever happened. I had to, like, summon. I mean, he of course summoned it in his songs, you know? And I love thinking about Jacques Brel when I'm in, like, the Low Countries, you know, because, like,
he has a song, was that it?
Yeah. I adore him. I'm, like, a huge fan. Like, that was, like, the first time I ever heard an artist say that. Like, and I was like, I relate to this completely. Like, if I don't write a book, my life won't change. But we are changing all the time. But for some reason, it's a medium. It's weird. Somebody asked me the other day, like, do you get anxious, like, once the word is fixed on the page or whatever? And I used to, I guess, but it's also unstable. But the book is a very living form, it's a very ancient form. And life proceeds and consciousness expands. But then when you kind of make a prism of it, and all of you who are artists, it's like, I think it's true, like, once you've moved into, like, a work and then somehow followed it to its realization, then you go into a kind of quantum time where even if it takes it feels like it takes a really long time to produce the work, because it can sometimes feel like an eternity when you're inside it. But once it's released, time changes and life changes. And I don't know, it's the only way of change that I know. I mean, there's, like, sex changes your life, you know, moving to another place, but, like, an artwork it's like a time machine or like a spaceship or something. Like, you can really travel fast. I think it has to do with a sort of, poetry in particular. Maybe you could comment if it's the same for dance or in other art forms, but poetry is really related to death. Mm-hmm. I think the impulse for it and the history of it, and its greatest practitioners were very conscious that they were vanquishing ordinary mortality. Mm-hmm. Not only, like, for the ancient Greeks and the Roman poets, it was connected to fame meaning being known by other people. Mm-hmm. But for somebody like Shakespeare or John Donne or something, they're actually doing these almost amazing mathematical operations inside of their poems where they're vanquishing death in their line breaks. And they're seducing it, they're turning it inside out and upside down. And then the fact that their works have endured proves that they indeed succeeded. Mm-hmm. And I think poetry in particular is like, its impulse is totally death. And the poet's facing death at the end of every line. Mm-hmm. And that's why enjambment is, like, so great, because you're like, nope, I'm not going to die at the end of this line. And that's also why we have such crazy fucked up lives. Mm. Like, probably all the arts are connected to death. Probably everything is, but poetry is very close, like, it's so naked. So it's very close to that essential motive. Mm. And the moment's always dying. and we're always aging and all that. But it's this kind of trick that refreshes and undoes decay. And because also, and this is the last thing I'll say about this particular thing, is like, because as an art form, it doesn't require any external power. Like you say, like, where do you summon the energy? Like the energy of it actually carries you through life. So once you realize, oh, I'm in a work, like I'm in a book. Like for me, the title always comes first, and I'll be like flailing around in my life, and then I realize I'm riding the cow or something, and that gives shape to existence. And then the art form, the poetry, gives the energy to have it be created. I'm sorry, this is so weird to describe. You probably like, what is she talking about? But this is actually real. So you realize that there's a work. It's totally invisible, but for some reason, it's not real until you realize it. Once you realize it, then you start receiving energy from it. And that energy allows you to create it. And sometimes it takes a Herculean amount of energy, like a sandbook that was 7 years. So like I needed a lot of energy to write that. And different helpers came in, like the peacock arrived, and it was like, if I follow the peacock, I can find my way to the end of this book, you know? So the work gives you the thing, but then when it's done, you're like, you get like years back.
But does that mean it's a pure composition of things that are already there?
What do you mean?
Like that it's basically all given to you, and there's just moments where its composition starts to take on a form that you can deal with.
Yeah, but it's not effortless.
No.
Sometimes it's like really strenuous.
Sure.
Probably it's all given, and maybe, you know, and some parts of it are effortless, but some of it takes like a lot of sweat to accomplish. Is this like so abstract, or is this making sense to you?
No, it makes sense. Probably
Probably you have this experience.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I'm like entering delirium now.
In much of your work, you don't write in dense units, but there is a lot of like the use of a heart return, and stanzas appear with ample space, kind of. And we spoke about this in Amsterdam yesterday, and now I'm thinking about it actually in terms of the working toward death. How do you break the line and break the page? And why do you tend to use capaciousness rather than density? And then in Save the World, which is self-published, the first 3 pages are, your music makes me feel lonely. Your music makes me feel lonely. Your music makes me feel lonely. And maybe you could speak to that example in terms of like death, line break, and page break.
Sure, yeah. So Save the World is a long poem that's in Mercury, which is a very hard book to get right now. So I'm sorry about that. But that was my first long poem. And for me, that was like a breakthrough artistically, because I realized like that instead of thinking in the unit of the line or the stanza, that I could stay in the feeling of the poem for like many hours. I was also like on a certain kind of drugs at that time. And I feel like poets, you know, like Auden did cocaine. Like there's different ways that like when you're young and you're like finding your way in to the frequency, like different things, different like external combustions can like break you into the space of that. And like a certain kind of like stimulation made me realize like, oh, I can stay in this feeling of the poem and I can extend it. And that was super exciting. It's almost like drone music or something. Like it changes over time. You can enter a very specific frequency and actually like your whole mind can extend and expand into that space. And that's what that poem represented for me. And then it became really difficult for me to write shorter poems. Like I got so excited about extending that feeling And it was almost like, oh, I'm like building a mansion. Like I can like add all these rooms. Like I can have as much space as I want. And then I felt like I wasn't a real poet anymore, because like real poets write these like amazing things that then they're over.
Mm-hmm.
So it took me like years to like learn how to do that again. Sorry, I feel like I'm having like talking anxiety.
Doesn't seem like. No.
Okay, I won't. I'm cured. You should do that like professionally. Like $350 for 15 minutes, and you just like let the person yammer on, and then just be like, don't be anxious.
Okay, last question, and then I will open it up. Chris Kraus calls your debut "The Cow, a surfeit of I, drowning in others." In "The Cow" you write, "I was a rock, plugged, I was a hole emptied. A strong sense of non-belonging where the body can't carry the content it is living." In a sandbook you write, "My heart was God's vessel beckoning for my attention."
I wrote that? I feel like I would never.
You would never? No.
I would never say that about my heart. My heart was God's vessel. Are you sure?
I am sure.
I'm embarrassed. I do not think of myself as somebody who would say that.
Okay.
God's vessel. No. Strike that from the record. Oh my God.
Okay, then there's something about like the historical moment that I want you to write about. Okay, there is the mid-2000s where you started writing, before financial crisis or the iPhone, before Trump. Can you say something about that specific historical moment of writing? And then in today's historical present, where destruction and ongoing erosion of collective life even more creates a sense of that, a sense of stability of the I is also something that one needs. Mm-hmm. And perhaps, can you say something about that and how the figure of God figures in that, if at all?
Wow. A really simple question.
I know.
Thank you. So The Cow was my first book, was an attempt to reckon with industrial slaughter and like maternal transmission of trauma. And that was before the science on epigenetics had come out, actually. But it's very much kind of about epigenetics and inherited trauma, industrial slaughter, and in a sense, I was also trying to industrially slaughter modernism. Like I was trying to work out the 20th century. And I was trying to figure out if there was an I in there, in all of that. Like I felt sort of full of all of this world, but I couldn't really find me in all of it. And at the same time, I had been in like the gay poetry slam scene in Boston in the late 90s. And all poetry slam, all spoken word poetry is very dependent on the I. But in college, I was taught that I was unsophisticated and language poetry was better. But it seemed like there was a kind of racialized disdain for art that said I, and that people of a certain privilege, which was also white people, didn't need to say I anymore because they were a certain kind of Marxist and they were, presenting their critique without resorting to the bad taste of talking about themselves. And that implied that the only people who need to talk about themselves are subaltern or oppressed in some way. But that fed into a kind of snobbery that was existing in the art world and that was existing in literature when I was a young woman. And one of the things that Chris Kraus did in publishing first-person fiction by women was to rescue the I and also present a lot of different kinds of literary practice that were narrative fiction using I, but that were still immensely inventive and that nobody could say weren't sophisticated or didn't count as art. But I think, Chris is someone who her work it wasn't until my generation that she started to get the celebration that she really deserved. She was very, very made fun of and disdained by many of her peers, some of whom were my direct teachers. So it was it's very interesting to see how that sometimes in literature and in culture, it takes time for something to be recognized. And we talked about autofiction the other day, which, it's not like autofiction was invented 10 or 15 years ago, but in some ways it's become a very attractive or a very prevalent mode in fiction. But it's different from, what I do is lyric poetry. It's not the same. And it's also not the same as the kind of I that was really, really nauseating in the early 2000s is what people were writing on their blogs. That was just I, but in this, to me, really irritating kind of way. So I will say that I think that I like deconstruction actually, but some of the ways that there's this insistence on there being no self or no essential self or no unified ground of being, I think that that's actually been very damaging to people, and I see it very psychologically and socially damaging. And I don't agree with it. It's not that I think that there is a stable I or that I want to sort of militarily defend my identity or whatever. I don't like that stuff. I really am not really into that stuff. But I do feel that the human being is more than a subject, and the human being is much more than mere subjectivity. I think the idea that all we have is our subjectivity is a complete insult. I think it's a way of it's an atheistic insult. All you have is your lived experience or whatever. Is that that in the built environment, all that shit we say, it's you might as well be a rat in a laboratory. It's so very impoverished. And I think actually, Paul Celan said, there is no ipso facto reality. Reality must be sought and won. And that's true, but it's worth the adventure. It's worth seeking. It's worth seeking the real. And it's worth finding a ground of being from which you could say I, without that I being merely the impoverished critical theory I of the last 30 years or something. God, I could have been so much meaner.
Any questions?
You have one. You do, yeah.
Yes, but it's not about the last things you said. I wrote one down. It's arbitrary in a way. You said that there were many projects happening while you were on your way to Sandbook. How do you make up for yourself that a poem is for a specific project and not for the other? How does it mix up? How do you keep the order?
Yeah, it's a good question. I work really hard on structure because it doesn't come naturally to me. I'm not naturally gifted for it. And because the Sandbook is such a large book, I spent 2 years on the structure. So really basic like nuts and bolts answer is usually normally at the beginning, I cut really deeply. So the first assemblage of a manuscript, and this is only one kind of art, right? But it'll be the most severe cut, and then I'll kind of gently start bringing things back in, because usually I tend to be guilty of cutting out too much because I'm very self-critical and I have like poor imagination, and I have anxiety, so I want to cut out all the good stuff, you know. But then I like gently bring more back in, and you know, and then it depends on the work itself. But like, yeah, for a sand book, I spent a solid 2 years on the structure, and new parts of the poem were being written as I worked on the book. Like a partial history, which I read to you tonight, that came fairly late in the process. But I'll work on structure as long as I have to, basically, because I really, really like the form of the book, and I really want my books to be like continent. Like I don't want them to be leaky. You know what I mean? So the structure will ultimately dictate what stays and what goes, and some things just won't fit. You know what I mean? But like it's very like, it's much more like artisanal. Like it's not like inspirational. It's like literally just like testing things and moving things. But that's like the most important part of bookmaking for me.
Does it happen then that once you're somewhere in the structure, like have an idea about the structure, and you cut away a certain poem of which you thought, okay, it doesn't fit here, and then like, you read it later?
Yeah, so then you put it back in.
Oh, okay, but does it happen that these poems get used for other projects? Is there like overlap?
Some poems show up in a lot of different spaces, like they live. Some of them have to be in the book for the flow of the book, and some of them have a lot of different lives in other contexts. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question in a satisfying way, but it's like, and sometimes you cut out something that you like, but there's just like, you could never figure out the last 2 lines or something, and so it didn't get to be in the book, type of a thing. But I imagine structuring a novel must be much more infuriating, because at least poems have these, you know, they begin and end, you know, and you can like move them around. Coeur De Lion is a long narrative poem. It's one poem. And, but that was a product of inspiration. So I just sat my ass down and ate my beef jerky and I wrote it. And pretty much everything I wrote is in it, I think, for that one. Yeah.
I was kind of wondering how you look at the book you already wrote, like you read them back, and how, like emotionally, how is it?
Like, what does it feel like?
Yeah, it's kind of intimate, but okay.
Yeah, no. I don't really read them. Like, I don't like sit around and read them, but I'll read them when, you know, a new edition has to happen, or in the case of a San book, to make the audiobook, I read the whole book aloud, and I actually think it's better aloud. And it's kind of wild to have that experience, because the thing we were talking about the books changing your life and all that sort of thing, like, and I think I know for a fact this isn't only true for me, it's for anyone who writes. Like, when you reread it, you will see how prophetic it was. Much more than you had any idea at the time, or even right after. Because you have to reread it while you're editing it, and while, you know, going through the editorial process. In a Sand book, it was hilarious because the copy edits were like a nightmare. Like, I don't know what was going on astrologically, but like I would like make the corrections and like give them to the editors, and then they'd give the text back to me, and there would be all these new mistakes. And it was like, I would like shit a brick like every time. And there was a dead, you know what I mean? I think we went through the copy edits like 9 times because they kept adding new mistakes. And then I'm only human, so I miss things. So like reading it like a million times, you know? But you have to read it over and over again, or else it isn't good. Like if you know, because like you get sick of yourself. I have a very low tolerance for myself in many ways. I mean, it's grown because I fucking do this for a living, so I've been forced to endure myself. But yeah, I felt like a sandbook actually is even better book aloud than on the page. And I thought that was really exciting. And most of all, I would say like, and this is like kind of an intimate thing to admit, but I feel like they're alive. Like they feel very alive to me, which is weird because I'm not that person anymore, especially not for the old stuff. Like, but it doesn't feel dead to me. And there's like a lot of love in that. And humility, I suppose. But I think that all the artists when I think about all the artists that I love, I imagine they must feel that way. Like, and if I do feel a dead feeling, like it's going in the drawer. Like, so like to speak to some poems that get lost or something like that. Like if something leaves me feeling dead, it's not gonna stay in the work. Yeah. I see some other hands. I don't know. Maybe not. Yes.
Can you talk a bit more about social media?
Oh. What shall we talk about with social media?
I don't know. I'm not really familiar with a partial history. I heard it for the first time tonight. But it evoked a lot for me about social media.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you could talk more about whether we should be on it, how you use it.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good question. And you're right, a partial history is about it in some way, somehow, partly, partially. I really, really appreciate the people who aren't on it. I'm dating someone who isn't on it, and I really respect that. And he's a lot younger than me, and I feel like that is even more impressive. Probably we shouldn't be on it, but the way that I've come to think about it, and I'm like, this is literally like, I like wouldn't write an essay like trying to defend this, but this is honestly the thought experiment that I use about it daily. I do believe it's meant to expand our consciousness. And I do believe that in the best cases it does. And it's partly because of something that the Sun says in a sandbook. The Sun says technology is for communication. So I see you have the book, and it's one of the things it's one of the really unusual things that some of the things the Sun said, I like at the time, I was like, what? You know, like I wasn't like most of me was like in rapture. So I was like in a kind of, I don't know, a kind of mystical state of total understanding, but there was still the me being like, what? At the same time, if that makes sense. And the Sun said, technology is for divine communication. All its other forms are byproducts. So all technology is communicative according to the Sun. So if you think about technology that's not specifically about communication, like, I don't know, like sewage, what are those things called? Like those huge turbines that like churn sewage. Like they're not literally, like they're not social media, but but that actually what the sun was saying is literally all tools, all technology, that would include like hammers, swords, like whatever, like anything technological that you can think of, trains, planes, automobiles, that is all actually for communication, and that it's other outward forms, like technological devices that aren't specifically communication oriented, they're byproducts. The sun says this. So I've been thinking about this now for like 5-6 years, and I feel that as much insanity and bigotry and cruelty and loneliness and psychosis as seems to foment through social media, and in many ways it seems extremely bad. But I think of it as something like a process of maturing the collective psyche, because we keep on seeing things we don't want to be true about us through it, and it keeps magnifying ways that we hate to be. I had a sentence and it just left my mind because of social media. Because, like, I wrote a book, Mercury, which I wish I could give you, but it's hard to get a copy of it right now. And that book was about alchemy, but it was also about the internet. And I was really, really interested in trying to think of the internet as a physical substance and a substance of change, which is how Mercury functions in alchemy. So it's a kind of Mercury's between things. Like you need Mercury to do other things to other metals, but it's the go-between. So it's the substance through which change takes place in that tradition, in alchemy, which turned into chemistry. And I was also trying to deal with porn. Like I had like a boyfriend who was addicted to porn, and I was trying to deal with how that made me feel. And I felt like one of the things that I was learning about consciousness and a sense of like, what does it mean to see things that horrify you? What does it mean to be forced to see things that horrify you? That somehow you're not innocent once you've seen them. Like it's very depressing to lose that innocence. And at the same time, you can get your innocence back. And I think that cycle seems to be something necessary for the human soul. And I think we're in that dynamic process. So social media is horrifying and crazy making, lonely, all the things. All of it's true. And it's also this terrible loss of innocence, because it's like, but I'm not like that. I don't believe in that. Who am I? Did I authorize this slaughter? Now that I'm a witness to it, what is it doing to me? Virginia Woolf wrote about this. So many writers tried to write about, what does it do to a person to see horror or to see whatever, bathos, just to see everything all the time? What does it do to a person? And I think you lose your innocence and you fall into the world somehow. But then you have to go through a kind of transmutational process. And we all have to, because none of us can live in that fornicating sinkhole of hell. And yet we do. But like nobody can live in that, right? No soul can endure it. So I think that we're actually in this transmutational process. I hope that somehow it's expanding our mind, that maybe we'll turn into the gray aliens once we've achieved reunion with our original soul after having waded through this bloodbath. Okay. I can tell you're all like, please stop talking. She has said enough. No, was there another hand? Okay, you're free. You're all free to go.
Okay, thank you so much, Ariana.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Rile Books podcast. You can find a sound book alongside many more of Ariana Reines' books on our website, www.rile.space. This episode was recorded, edited, and mastered by Ros Del Olmo. Rile Books is a bookshop and project space for publication and performance based in Brussels. Rile is funded by the Vlaamse Gemeenschapcommissie and supported by our ever-generous community of readers, writers, and listeners.